A city built on water, not beside it, on it. No solid ground, no bedrock, just wooden pillars driven into mud, holding up marble palaces that have been sinking for 1,000 years. And here's the thing, it sank once, recovered, then sank again. And somehow, it's still here. This is Venice. And its survival is one of the most stubborn acts of defiance in human history. But the question isn't just how it survives. It's why it keeps refusing to die. Most cities are built on something solid. Rock, stone, earth that doesn't move. Venice? Venice was built on nothing. In the 5th century, as the Roman Empire collapsed and barbarian armies swept across Italy, a group of refugees fled to the marshy lagoons of the Adriatic coast. They were running from warlords, from chaos, from the end of civilization as they knew it. And they found swamp. Not land, not safety, just shallow water, tidal flats, and 100 small islands that flooded twice a day. Any rational group would have kept moving, but they didn't, because the one thing the swamp had was something their enemies didn't want: isolation. So they stayed, and they started building. But here's the hidden truth most people don't know. Venice isn't built on those islands. It's built into them. The early Venetians drove thousands, sometimes millions, of wooden stakes into the soft lagoon floor. Alder, oak, larch, trees that harden underwater instead of rotting. They hammered them down through mud and clay until they hit a layer of compressed sediment called coranto, a kind of natural concrete formed over millennia. Then they laid platforms of Istrian stone on top. And on those platforms, they built a city. But wood, even hardened wood, doesn't last forever. And water is patient. From the very beginning, Venice was sinking. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, millimeter by millimeter, year after year. By the year 1000, the city had already begun to flood regularly. The streets, many of them canals by design, started filling with seawater during high tides. The Venetians called it aqua alta, high water, and they adapted. They raised the floors of their buildings, built new doorways above the old ones, installed stone pathways that sat higher than street level. They didn't fight the water, they lived with it. For centuries, this worked. Venice became one of the wealthiest cities on earth, a maritime empire, a center of trade, art, and power, the gateway between Europe and the East. But beneath the grandeur, the foundation was failing. And in the 1960s, something terrifying happened. Venice began to sink faster. November 4th, 1966, the Arno River in Florence bursts its banks. A devastating flood tears through Tuscany, destroying priceless Renaissance art and manuscripts. But while the world was watching Florence, Venice was drowning. That same day, a storm surge from the Adriatic collided with high tide and relentless rain. The water rose higher than it had in recorded history, nearly 2 meters above normal sea level. St. Mark's Square, the heart of Venice, became a lake. The basilica flooded. Ancient mosaics cracked under the pressure. Centuries-old crypts filled with salt water. Shops, homes, and palaces were submerged. For the first time in its long history, Venice faced the real possibility of abandonment. And here's the terrifying part. The flood wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom. Scientists discovered something the Venetians had been trying to ignore. The city wasn't just sinking because of its wooden foundation. It was sinking because humans had been draining the aquifers beneath it. For decades, factories and industries around Venice had been pumping groundwater from deep underground. As the water was extracted, the ground above it compacted, collapsed inward. Venice was literally being pulled down from below. Between 1950 and 1970, the city sank an additional 12 centimeters. That might not sound like much, but in a city already at sea level, it was catastrophic. And the ocean? The ocean was rising. Global sea levels had been climbing for decades due to climate change and melting polar ice. Venice, sitting at the edge of a shallow lagoon, was one of the most vulnerable cities on the planet. By the 1970s, scientists were predicting the city would be uninhabitable by the year 2000. And then, something unexpected happened. Venice fought back. In 1984, the Italian government approved one of the most ambitious and controversial engineering projects in modern history. It was called MOSE, Modulo Sperimental Elettromeccanico, Experimental Electromechanical Module. But everyone just called it Moses, because like the biblical figure, it was supposed to part the sea. The plan was simple in concept, impossibly complex in execution. At the three entrances to the Venice Lagoon, where the Adriatic Sea flows in, engineers would install massive underwater barriers. 78 individual gates, each weighing 300 tons, lying flat on the seabed. When high tides threatened to flood the city, compressed air would be pumped into the gates, causing them to rise and form a temporary wall, blocking the sea from entering the lagoon. When the tide receded, the gates would sink back down, a retractable dam, a modern marvel, a hidden defense against the ocean itself. But from the start, MOSE was plagued by problems. The project was supposed to take 5 years. It took 37. Costs exploded. The original budget of $2 billion ballooned to over $7 billion. Corruption scandals erupted. Politicians and contractors were arrested. Environmental groups warned that isolating the lagoon could destroy its delicate ecosystem. Critics called it a disaster before it even worked. And then in 2020, decades behind schedule, they finally turned it on. October 3rd, 2020. For the first time, all 78 gates rose simultaneously. The sea was held back. Venice stayed dry. It was a triumph. A proof that human ingenuity could outsmart nature. But here's the uncomfortable truth. MOSE is not a solution. It's a delay. The gates can only be raised so many times before they wear out. Salt water corrodes metal. Hinges fail. Maintenance costs are astronomical. And the system only works for tides up to 3 meters. If sea levels rise beyond that, and climate models predict they will, MOSE becomes useless. So Venice bought itself time. But for how long? Venice isn't just fighting the ocean. It's fighting itself. Tourism, the very thing keeping the city's economy alive, is killing it. Every year, more than 30 million tourists flood Venice. They outnumber the permanent residents by a staggering margin. Cruise ships, floating cities themselves, dock just offshore, sending waves through the lagoon that erode the foundations of centuries-old buildings. The constant foot traffic, the vibrations, the sheer weight of millions of people moving through narrow streets. It all accelerates the decay. And the locals? They're leaving. In 1950, Venice had 175,000 residents. Today, fewer than 50,000 remain in the historic center. The city is becoming a museum, a theme park, a place people visit but don't live in. And then there's climate change. Sea levels are rising faster than predicted. The Mediterranean is warming. Storms are intensifying. In November 2019, just 1 year before MOSE was activated, Venice experienced the second worst flood in its history. Water surged to 187 centimeters above sea level. St. Mark's Basilica flooded for the 6th time in 1,200 years. But here's the chilling part. 4 of those 6 floods happened in the last 20 years. Scientists now estimate that by 2100, Venice could experience acqua alta events not once or twice a year, but every single day. At that point, MOSE would need to stay closed permanently, which means the lagoon would stagnate. The ecosystem would collapse. the city would suffocate. So Venice faces an impossible choice: hold back the sea and die slowly from isolation, or open the gates and drown. But here's what makes this story more than just a tragedy. Venice has been dying for 1,000 years, and it's still here, because the Venetians have always understood something the rest of us forget. Survival isn't about permanence. It's about adaptation. When the first floods came in the Middle Ages, they didn't abandon the city, they raised it. When the wooden foundations began to rot, they replaced them. When the 1966 flood nearly destroyed everything, they didn't give up. They built MOSE, and now, as the waters rise again, Venice is evolving once more. Architects are designing floating foundations, amphibious buildings that rise and fall with the tide. Engineers are experimenting with bioconcrete, living materials that repair themselves using bacteria. Urban planners are rethinking the entire concept of a city, not as something fixed in place, but as something fluid, dynamic, responsive to the environment. Because Venice was never supposed to exist. It's a city that defied logic from the very beginning. And that defiance, that refusal to accept defeat, that's its true foundation. Not wood, not stone, but human stubbornness. And maybe that's the real mystery here. Not how long Venice can survive, but why we need it to. Venice is more than a city. It's a symbol, a reminder that humanity has always built in impossible places, that we've always pushed boundaries, that we've always refused to let nature have the final word. But it's also a warning, because if Venice falls, if the ocean finally wins, it won't just be the loss of a city. It will be the loss of 1,000 years of art, history, and human achievement. It will be proof that some things, no matter how beautiful, no matter how defiant, can't last forever. But here's the thing. Venice has sunk twice, and both times it came back. So maybe the real question isn't if it will survive. Maybe the question is, how many times can a city refuse to die before we finally learn what it's trying to teach us? The water is rising, but Venice is still standing, and it's not done fighting yet. If this story made you see Venice, or the world, differently, hit that like button and stay with us for more. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about what we're willing to fight for right now.